Hello everyone and welcome back for another video. This will actually be the last video in our Period 9 web question review for APUSH history. It's a little bit long. I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. Remember, if you have any questions, you can ask them in the comments below or send me an email. Okay, so something that's important about American government when we move into the 21st century is that both parties start to experience kind of a fundamental shift in where they're getting their votes from and where they're getting their support from. So the Republican Party shifts from kind of the party of the working man and things like that, and it becomes the party of people who live in suburbs and people who live in rural areas. And one of the biggest places we see this take place is in the rural South, where many go from being Southern Democrats to Republicans. And another shift it goes through as it comes into the 21st century is the Republican Party goes to a much more conservative and partisan platform, which can actually be said for the Democratic Party. One thing that I think all of us can realize who live in the world today is that as we've gone on, our politics have become more divisive. So the Democratic Party begins to gain more support from diverse urban city dwellers, where the Republicans depend on rural and suburban areas. And one thing, and you're going to do an activity to learn about this, is gerrymandering. It's used to ensure that parties maintain control. So every 10 years, it's 2020 now, so you're doing a census, and what will happen is after that census comes out, whichever party is in charge in the state will get to redraw the lines for what the congressional districts will be. And the problem with this is there's rules that are supposed to be followed, but in pretty much every case, the government that is in charge will take this opportunity to try to create districts that ensure that their party will stay in control. Now, if we look at this, so if you see this, 60% of this precinct is blue, and then 40% is red. So if you break them into 5 rectangular districts, blue wins, which should be right because they have 60% of the vote. However, if I use gerrymandering, I can pack pretty much all of the blue blocks into these 2 districts, and then with my 3 other blocks, I can then ensure that the red party is going to win because there's very few remaining blue districts left. That is an example of how we can use gerrymandering to take what 40% of the population believes and turn it into a victory. The election of 2000 will go down as one of the most controversial, if not the most controversial election in the history of the country. Al Gore will actually beat Bush in the popular vote by about 500,000, but George Bush will narrowly win the electoral vote, and it will come down to Florida right here. Okay, we're talking about the hundreds, not the thousands of votes, the hundreds numbers of votes that determine the election. If you'll notice, the red states are your rural states, and then your highly populated states are more blue. But it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court eventually ruled that the recount in Florida favored Bush, and Bush would become the president, even though he did not win the popular vote. The next time we see this happen is when Trump wins in 2016. One important thing to think about here is Ralph Nader of the Green Party was able to steal enough votes from Gore. What we call this is the spoiler effect. So a lot of people who would have voted for Gore went and voted for the Green Party, which in turn Bush got more votes. Even though he didn't get more votes, he was not getting votes against him because they were going for Nader instead of Gore. First years of Bush's presidency, he advocated for a lot of things his dad and Reagan advocated for: tax cuts, less government, deregulation, and conservative family values. As we talked about in the last video, President Clinton presided over a budget surplus in the United States, and Bush is going to inherit that. He gives tax cuts to the wealthy once again, which causes a large deficit, just like what happened during the Reagan era. Bush's one of the more notable things he did was pass No Child Left Behind, which was an effort to improve public schools. It didn't end up working because, as you'll find, states are generally better at meeting the needs of their students than the federal government because there's so much diversity in the country, and there's just too many rules, too much testing, and not enough resources for Bush's No Child Left Behind program to work out. As most of you probably know, Bush's presidency was plagued with terrorist attacks. 9/11, obviously the Twin Towers were attacked in New York, the Pentagon was crashed, and then there was a flight that crashed in Pennsylvania. This is the largest attack on America since Pearl Harbor, and Bush, who is a guy with relatively little foreign experience, is going to surround himself with Dick Cheney, who used to be the defense, I believe, advisor for his father. Dick Cheney would be the vice president, and then Colin Powell would become the Secretary of Defense. Cool side note, he is the first black man to hold this title in history. And these advisors basically pushed him to take a tough stance on terror. Now, what we need to ask ourselves is, why are so many Muslim countries not liking America that cause these terrorist attacks, and why are they turning to these ideas? Many Muslims did not like that America had taken the side of Israel in the conflict with Palestine and the disputed territory in that area. Many Muslims look back to the effects of World War I and how Western powers had caused the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which was the last Islamic nation in the world. Another big thing is when these Western nations went in, they tried to set up secular governments. That means there's separation of God and country. What that meant was that Muslim or Islamic tenets could not be in government, and many of these countries wanted Sharia Muslim law to be part of the government, not separate from government. And then obviously whenever you have an invading force or an occupying force, many of the Muslims did not like the fact that America was occupying their territory after the Gulf War. And as we have talked about time and time again, poor economies contribute to unrest within the people. The Middle East economies were not great. Because of that, people are willing to turn to more radical people to help have their needs met. And the Middle East was no different in that case. Notable terrorist attacks that took place, the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993 was carried out. There was an attack on the USS Cole in Yemen, and then there was the attack on September 11th. And what Bush is going to have trouble with is, in every war before this, America is fighting clear enemy. World War II, we're fighting Germany, Japan, and Italy. World War I, we're fighting Austria and Germany. Okay? In the war on terror, we are fighting an ideology. We're not fighting a country, which is what makes these conflicts so difficult to fight. Afghanistan is the first place that America attacks. Bush wanted to capture bin Laden, who had been responsible for the 9/11 attacks. They're not able to capture bin Laden, but the Taliban is overthrown and the U.S. government's put in place. But as we just talked about, these areas do not want secular governments, so the region would stay unstable. Another thing that's created is the Department of Homeland Security. The president creates a whole new administrative branch. That sole task is to ensure that the American homeland stays safe. And then there are some other pretty radical measures taken after 9/11. There was the Patriot Act, which allowed for surveillance if terrorism was suspected, which would be a violation of the Fourth Amendment, but we ruled that since it's a time of emergency, that the Patriot Act and this surveillance was allowed. Many people did not like that people suspected of terrorism were tried by military tribunals rather than civilian court. And then finally, suspected terrorists could be locked up for an indeterminate amount of time on Guantanamo Bay, which angered many people who thought this was a violation of their human rights. One thing that really hurt Bush's second term was the fact that he said there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which is why he went and fought in Iraq. A UN investigation force had gone in and they found no weapons of mass destruction. Bush thought they might find some. They never did, so a lot of people think that America invaded Iraq for no reason. However, the 2004 election, the Democrats will put up John Kerry to run against Bush. Bush runs on the platform of he's been hard on the war on terror. He's going to continue tax cuts, which many Americans like, and he's also going to keep pushing for religious and fundamental issues, things like stem cell research, limits on that, and then abortion. Republicans win this election easily and also regain control of the House, which will allow Republicans to attempt to get more conservative things pushed through. Bush's second term is met with a lot of issues. First off, Hurricane Katrina hits, and it exposes that the federal government is vastly unprepared for this. Many Republican officials were also corrupt and benefited and made money off their actions during this, and then it was not a good look for the presidency. You know, obviously the Republican Party pulls a lot of the white population, whereas the Democratic Party pulls from a lot of Latin Americans and African Americans. and Katrina impacted mostly poor African Americans, which was not a good look for Bush's presidency. And he also was in office at the start of the Great Recession, which was basically caused by risky house loans that were loaned to people who were not ready to buy houses. When they couldn't pay back their loans, a lot of them defaulted, and many of the big banks failed. And this was also coupled with the price of gas going way, way up. In the end, the government had to provide a big bailout. The funny thing is, it got passed, but Democrats didn't like it because it was taking care of wealthy companies, so they thought it was for the elite. At the same time, Republicans didn't like it because they thought it was very socialist, that the government would be helping out industries and taking some over. Like, for example, General Motors filed for bankruptcy, and the United States government took over General Motors for a while, which is kind of a socialist principle, but it was handed back to them. Election of 2008, like we talked about, Bush was not popular. Hillary Clinton was supposed to be tapped as the nomination for the Democratic Party, but President Barack Obama, or candidate Barack Obama, comes out of nowhere and takes the Democratic nomination. He runs on the idea of change, and he's also able to use social media to his advantage, and pretty much easily defeats John McCain to win the presidency. Would become the first black president in history, had the most attended inauguration in history, and early on in his presidency, he ended the practice of torture in the War on Terror. They called them advanced interrogation techniques. He tried to do away with those, and he also pushed for equal pay for women, implemented the Cash for Clunkers program to try to stimulate the American economy. If you bought a car, you'd get a tax credit for your crappy old car, and this was supposed to cause people to buy new cars. And he also started his fight for the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, that was supposed to help poor Americans get health care. This is a picture. It shows you Obama's down here looking out on the crowd. As you can see, there are a ton of people there. Problems in the Obama presidency: the Tea Party becomes a force in the Republican Party. They push for more partisan issues like gun rights, tax reform, and traditional American values. That's why they called themselves the Tea Party. They thought they were getting back to the basics. But this movement was significant enough that Republicans are able to take back the House in the midterm elections in 2010. But the Democrats are still in control, obviously, in the Senate and White House. And then Obama pulls troops out of Iraq, but ramps up troop numbers in Afghanistan, and he is eventually able to do what Bush was not able to do and get Osama bin Laden killed. But during this time, there's a string of rebellions going on in the Middle East and Northern Africa called the Arab Spring, where people are pushing for democracy in these countries. And President Obama was sympathetic with these causes and supported them, which hurt him with some of the oil-rich countries in the Middle East, which did not like the idea of democracy in the region because that was not something they practiced. But he was also criticized by many Americans who thought he should do more to help these revolutions. So it's kind of a catch-22 for the president when it came to that. Getting close to the end now. On 2012, Obama wins easily. The big issue of his campaign is Obamacare. In that election, he's able to win important swing states on his path to the White House. And all a swing state is a state that historically does not side with one party. It could flop either election. The big ones are Florida and Ohio. Obama carried large numbers of Hispanics and African Americans, but his second term will be plagued by a government shutdown, issues with the budget, issues with tax cuts, and then issues with Obamacare. And he is never able to get gun legislation through, which he wanted to do because of the many mass shootings that took place in America. Those were blocked by a powerful gun lobby. And then those issues and the things that plagued his second term is one of the things that's going to allow Trump to take back the White House for the Republican Party, because many average Americans are not pleased that they're not getting jobs. The government's shutting down. They didn't feel like their needs were being met. Some important Supreme Court cases to remember from the 21st century. Shelby County versus Holder allowed states to require IDs to vote. Many in the South did not like this because they thought they were akin to the poll taxes of the 1960s and trying to obstruct blacks from voting. Citizens United versus the FEC allowed for corporations to form super PACs, which basically allowed unlimited campaign contributions. Opponents of this thought that it allowed too much corruption and too much money in politics, which these presidential elections, we're talking about billions of dollars getting spent on presidential elections. So that's something to definitely think about. Massachusetts versus the EPA allowed the government to enforce laws that limit emission on greenhouse gases. So that allows the government and shows that they are taking on the issue of global warming and treating it as a real thing. But during the end of Obama's presidency, the big thing that he will leave trying to battle is the issue of federal and states debating over who should be in charge when it comes to immigration laws. And that is something that carries on to today. So that's all I got for you guys. I appreciate you tuning in, and I will see you next time.